Today I'm going to talk about bulb mode, live bulb, and live time for your Olympus camera. Okay, so what is bulb mode, live bulb, and live time? Basically we're talking about long exposure photography where the shutter will be open from several seconds to several minutes to up to 30 minutes on the Olympus cameras. And long exposure photography is like those pictures you see of those cityscapes where it's across the river, but then the river is smooth as glass and you see this beautiful reflection of the city in the river. Other types of long exposure are like the star trails where you see like these circles in the sky, which are the stars streaking across. So there's all kinds of live exposure or long exposure type photography. So I recommend you check out some long exposure tutorials giving you some creative ideas so that maybe you can come up with some of your own. Now Olympus gives you a lot of different settings in the camera to help you control long exposures. Hence the three modes: bulb, live bulb, and live time. But there's some other settings that we can go into that impact the long exposure as well and make some things easier. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few tips as we go through the settings to help you do long exposure photography. But it's really not that complicated. So, I have my ep.57 here. I just got this on eBay the other day. I don't know why, but anyway, let's look at I have this camera right now in bulb mode. And all bulb mode is you hold the shutter button down to start the exposure. And as long as you're holding the shutter button down, the shutter is open and taking a picture. And then you let go and it stops. Okay, and that's all bulb mode is. Live bulb is exactly the same thing. Okay, the only difference being is when I hold the shutter button down to take the picture, the back of the screen will update, showing you the exposure as it's happening until you let go before it writes to the card. Okay, and then live time is the same thing as live bulb, but instead of holding the shutter button down, okay, and let me put this into live time, all I have to do is push the shutter button once to start the exposure, wait 5 seconds, and then when I'm done, I just push it again, I can just push it again, and then the exposure stops and it writes it to the card. So that's mechanically speaking the only difference. Bulb mode, you have to hold the shutter button down, but the back of the screen is blank. Live bulb is you have to hold the shutter button down, but it shows you the exposure as it's happening on the back of the screen. And live time is you push the shutter button once, the exposure starts, updates on the back of the screen so you can watch it as it's happening, and then when you're ready to stop the exposure, you push the shutter button again. Okay, and that's the basic mechanical or logistics of bulb mode, live bulb, and live time. Now everything else that I'm going to talk about are the settings in the menu, and these are things that will help you take long exposures, okay? Or, there's some limitations as well. So let's go ahead and go into the menu. How do you get into bulb mode, right? That's the first thing. Well, basically, like I have on the back of the camera here, you have to be in manual mode to put the camera into bulb mode. So let's go into manual mode, as indicated here. And then you'll also see a little M down here on the bottom left. And in manual mode, you still can control ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, right? You have to control all of those yourself in terms of exposure. But when you do long exposure photography, you need to change a couple other settings that we can do in the Super Control panel. Okay, first thing you want to do actually, because when you're doing long exposure photography, you're going to be on a tripod. You want to turn off the image stabilization, okay? Because if you leave it on, sometimes your pictures can be a little bit blurry because the image stabilizer is reading itself moving and trying to adjust. All right, so generally speaking, it's a good practice to turn it off. And then you can shoot in RAW or RAW plus JPEG, but I'll just leave this in large normal, okay, for the demonstration. Also, you want to change the shutter speed to anti-shock, okay, because you want to try to reduce as much vibration internal to the camera as possible. And this is true, like on the OMDs, the Pen F, and my EM1. The PL8s, the pens, don't seem to have an anti-shock shutter mode or silent mode, so you won't see that setting on this camera. But what I do want to note in the super control panel is you're not going to be able to use silent shutter when you're in bulb mode, so I'm not going to set it here, but you'll see when we get back to bulb mode. Okay, and then let's just shoot at ISO 200. Okay, we're locked in, and I don't care about all this, but I'm going to change the focus point to his eye. Okay, now when you're in manual mode, there's another difference as well. Okay, this exposure compensation meter is no longer the exposure compensation meter, because in manual mode you do exposure compensation by controlling everything. So what this is telling me now, this becomes an EV meter, or exposure value meter, and by it blinking -3, it's telling me I'm more than 3 stops underexposed. So if I were to try to take a picture here, you'll see it's completely blacked out because it's well more than 3 stops underexposed. Okay, now pay attention as I'm going into bulb mode, because to go into bulb mode, all you have to do is rotate the shutter speed dial. Okay, so I'm going to rotate the shutter speed dial, but watch the EV meter, okay, as I'm going down, because this will help you with your long exposures. Notice how this changed to -1. So this is telling me at 2.5 seconds at 5.6 ISO 200, I'm only 1 stop underexposed. And if I keep going, 5 seconds is telling me the camera thinks this is a properly exposed picture. So let's just take a picture here in manual mode for 5 seconds, okay, just for demonstration purposes. And now it's doing a noise reduction process here, and we'll talk about that as well for your long exposure photography. But if I look at the 5-second picture I just took, yeah, pretty much that's pretty well exposed. And as I cycle through the info button for this picture, you'll see 5 seconds, 5.6, ISO 200, and then there's the color histogram. Okay, so yeah, that looks pretty good. And also the focus point, as I had said before, is right on the eye here. Okay, all right. So let's continue rolling the shutter button, or shutter dial. And when you get past 60 seconds, right here, now we're in bulb mode. Okay, and the EV meter disappears because, you know, it doesn't know how long you're going to hold the shutter open. And bulb mode is exactly the same as I showed you on the PL8. I just hold the shutter button down, I let go, it takes the picture. Okay, but what you didn't see when I did it on here is when you hold the shutter button down, the screen goes blank in bulb mode, and then a little timer pops up in the bottom right corner down here. So look down here. Okay, so if I hold this shutter button down for 5 seconds, I should get the same exposure I did as before, right? Because I know that when I was going down in the shutter, when I was rolling the shutter dial down, I saw that 5 seconds was about the proper exposure, where the EV meter was reading 0. So if we look at that exposure, yeah, okay, so I did 5.62 seconds, not exactly 5, because again, I'm holding it manually down, right? But yeah, I got roughly the same picture in terms of exposure. So when you're rolling down the shutter speed, okay, in manual mode, just pay attention to the EV meter to kind of get a feel for what the camera thinks is a proper exposure, and then you can adjust it plus or minus from that shutter speed to the effect you're trying to get. Typically though, in bulb mode, you're running several minute timers, okay, depending on what you're shooting. Okay, so that's bulb mode with the screen going blank. Now live bulb, like I explained on the PL8, is you can actually watch the exposure happening, okay, as the shutter stays open. So this is good for when the exposure is over 1 minute, right? Because when we were scrolling down in manual mode, we could see from the EV meter what the proper exposure is roughly. But if the exposure is more than 1 minute, we have no idea. So let's just do a short example. I'm not going to hold it down for a minute, but let's go into live bulb. And to go into live bulb mode, it's in the menu system, but fortunately Olympus said if you push the menu button while you're in bulb mode, it'll jump right to that specific menu item. Okay, so now we're in the live bulb menu. But you'll notice there's the back button here for menu, right? If I just go out, I can see that the live bulb menu is down here in the custom menu, then in E for exposure, and then I'll scroll down to live bulb, and now we're back. So pushing the menu button just jumps you right to this menu here, okay? And when you're in the live bulb menu, okay, there's a little chart down here at the bottom that tells you how many times it's going to update the display. So the first line item here says ISO low 24 times. Second line item says ISO 400 19 times. So what this is telling me is that anytime I'm between ISO low and ISO 399, and I know there's no 399, but with respect to how this chart works, between low and 399 ISO, the display is going to update 24 times. So you'll see the exposure happening as it's being created, and this display will refresh up to 24 times. If I'm at ISO 400 up to 600 or 799, the display is only going to update 19 times. And then, following that logic, if I'm at 1600 or higher, the display is going to update only 9 times. Okay, and I don't understand why Olympus chose these numbers, 24, 19, 14. And I don't understand why they don't just let us select how many times we want the display to update, independent of what the ISO setting is. So Olympus, if you have a firmware update to change that, that would be nice, okay? But in any case, let's assume, okay, I'm at ISO 200 as we previously saw. So I know the display is going to update 24 times, but at what interval, okay? We can set the camera to update 24 times every half second, every second, or every 2 seconds, every 4 seconds, 8 seconds, and so on. So there's going to be an interval that this camera is going to update the display. So if I set it to say 1 second, okay, it's going to show me what the exposure looks like at 1 second, then it's going to show me at 2 seconds, then it's going to show me at 3 seconds. If I set it to say 8 seconds, then it's going to show me the exposure at 8 seconds. Then it's not going to update the display until we're at 16 seconds, and then not again until we're at 24 seconds. So, if the longer your exposure is, the longer the interval you want it to be, right? So if I set this to, okay, and that's where you set the intervals right here. If I set this to 1 second, and I'm at ISO 200, it's going to update the display 24 times, 1 second at a time. So I can see the display update for 24 seconds basically, or 25 seconds actually. So if my exposure is longer than 25 seconds, then I'm not going to see how it looks as the shutter stays open. So if I'm doing a 1 minute exposure, I'm only seeing half the exposure being updated. So you're going to have to do this math in your head to figure out which interval you're going to use based on the ISO you're in. So, if I was at ISO 1600, the display is only going to update 9 times because I'm at 1 second. So it's only going to update 9 times for 9 seconds. So if you're doing a 10-minute exposure, you do that math in your head, that's roughly, 24 times 10 seconds or 20 seconds. Anyway, you can do what I do. Let's bring a calculator to figure that out. But in any case, that's what this is. That's what this chart is for, is to help you calculate how long you want the display to update. So we'll just pick a half a second for now, okay? So now the display is going to update at the maximum rate of a half a second up to 24 times. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. You'll notice here now that this says live bulb, it doesn't just say bulb. So this tells me that if I hold the shutter button down, it's going to update the display while we're watching it. So let's just do another quick 5-second exposure, okay? And now you'll also see what's been added is the histogram and the display count, and then the timer still here down here at the bottom. Okay, so it just finished the exposure with the noise reduction, but you saw how you can watch the histogram being created while the exposure is happening. You can see how many times the display has been updated and if you've exceeded that. And then there's the timer at the bottom of how long you've held the shutter open. Okay, so let's do an example using a live time. Okay, so to go into live time, all you have to do is click over to the left. And then in live time, it has the same menu settings as live bulb. So we click the menu button, it'll jump to the live time. I believe that's the default 1 second. But this time, let's do an ISO 1600. Okay. So I'm going to change my ISO to 1600 because I want to show you what happens when you go past that 9 times. Okay. And then let me crank the aperture up. All right. Now in live time, I don't have to hold the shutter button down. I can let go and watch it happening. So we've done 8, 9, see the display count. Now the camera has stopped updating the display. Now what you're seeing is what happened at the end of 9 displays, which I think I had it at 1 second. So what I'm looking at here is a 9-second exposure, not a 24-second exposure as indicated by the timer down here. And you'll also notice that the histogram is not being updated either. So if I stop the exposure here, and we'll let this go, I'm going to get an extremely bright picture because I went 3 times over the original live time update of 9 frames, right? It's kind of a mouthful, right? We'll give this a second to finish so you can see. I'm sorry, I should have turned off noise reduction, but we'll talk about that in a minute because this is actually very important too in long exposure photography. So it's a nice feature to just have built into the camera. Okay, so let's look at that, and you can see now I did a 34-second exposure at f20, ISO 1600, but you can see the highlights are being blown out, and that this picture is much more brightly exposed. And because I'm at high aperture, you can see all the dust on my lens, all these little specks here. But that's neither here nor there. Okay, so let's get out of that. Okay, and that's basically it for bulb, live bulb, and live time. Okay, let's look at some of the settings that are designed to help you do or take better long exposure photography. Okay, we've already gone into the super control panel and turned off image stabilization, right? The other thing is you need to be on a tripod. Okay, another tip for doing long exposure photography, sometimes people buy these like remote triggers where they're either wired or wireless to the camera so that they don't actually have to touch the camera to start the exposure. But if you have an OMD or pen, or the PL8 doesn't have this, but if you go into the menu, we'll start with the first thing in the menu here. It's actually in shooting menu number 2. And we'll go into anti-shock. You can set the anti-shock timer shutter to say 2 seconds. And it looks like a maximum of 30 seconds, but we'll just do a 2-second delay. Okay, and you have to click OK a few times to make sure you've done that. But now what will happen is, when I push the shutter button, it'll wait 2 seconds before it starts the exposure, okay? And then I can stop it. So it eliminates, being in anti-shock mode, it eliminates potential shutter shock, and then putting that delay in also eliminates the little bit of vibration that might happen when I touch the shutter button. Okay, unfortunately it doesn't have that delay when you have to stop the exposure, but just, if you're very gentle, you probably won't get any image shake, okay? At least not enough to really notice. So that's one of the features built in to help you do long exposure photography if you don't have a remote trigger. Okay, and then let's go into the menu again. And that was shooting menu number 2. Nothing else we need there. Next thing we need to go into is the autofocus menu. Okay. This is another thing that'll help you do long exposure photography, because typically when you're doing long exposure photography, it's almost pitch black in a lot of cases. So what I want to do is program this function button to become a back button focus. Okay, and I did a whole video on back button focus, but all I need to do is change the AEL button to become the focus button, which is, looks like mode 3. The AEL button will now become the single point autofocus button if you're using an autofocus lens and you want to use autofocus to focus on whatever it is you're taking a picture of. Okay, and then the shutter now just becomes the halfway is for the auto exposure lock, and then fully is for to take the picture. Okay, so we're going to leave that in mode 3. Okay, let me just confirm. Yeah, mode 3. Okay, then the next thing we go into the button dial menu, just to confirm that function 1 is assigned to AEL AFL. Okay, and it is. So what this does is, you know, if it's really dark out, your autofocus system is not going to be able to focus on whatever it is that you want in the foreground. For example, if I want some rocks or trees in the foreground and I want those in focus, and in the background, you know, just by, you know, the depth of field, it will be in focus. Okay, but I want what's in the foreground to be sharp. So now that I've assigned the focusing to the back button, it allows me to do a couple of tricks to try to focus in the dark. Okay, so let me show you what that is, because you'll notice when I'm pushing the shutter button or half pressing it, it's not doing anything trying to focus. But when I hit the back button here, function 1, that is the focus. Now it's locked, so now I can kind of, you know, take the exposure without worrying about it trying to change focus or trying to refocus. But this scene here is very easy to focus with a camera, but I put an ND filter on here just to kind of simulate, you know, it being very dark out. Okay. Now if I ask the camera to try to focus, it can't. It's just too dark. So this is one of the tips is, you know, bring a flashlight with you. You know, this, I'm just going to use a small one because the subject's right here, but you can get these nice powerful tactical flashlights and just illuminate the focus point that you have set, just like I'm doing here. And then now the camera can focus. And now you can half press the shutter button, start your exposure, and not worry about it trying to refocus in the dark. Okay. Another use, or another thing that I did one time, is I actually used my car headlights to illuminate, you know, the entire face of these rocks and trees. And then I went over, I hit the back button focus to focus. Then I went back to the car, turned the lights off. Then I came back and started to do my bulb exposure. So setting up the camera for back button focus for night photography can be really handy. But let's stop that there, sorry. Okay, while that's going, let's talk about noise reduction, okay, what it's doing now. And we'll go into that next. Noise reduction, this is not for your JPEGs. This is actually noise reduction for your RAWs and your JPEGs. And what it's doing here is actually doing what they call creating a black frame, okay, which is typical in astrophotography. So what it does is, after it takes, in this case it took like a 30-second exposure, after it's done with that exposure, or you let go of the shutter button, it closes the shutter and then starts another picture. And that picture is going to be completely black except for any internal noise in the camera. You know, little specks and color noise and things that can happen internal to the camera, either through like some radio frequency interference, like your cell phone. Maybe it's kind of a hot day or hot evening, and that can cause noise on your sensor, more so than, say, if you're taking pictures on a cold night. So what it does is it looks for that noise for the same amount of time that the exposure was. So 30-second exposure will be a 30-second noise reduction black frame, and then it subtracts that noise from the original image. So It's a really nice feature to have built into the camera. So use that whenever you're doing long exposure, assuming you have the time for it to take twice as long, but I think it's worth it, okay? All right, so let's go back into the menu. And this time we're going to go into custom menu D for display. And we're going to scroll down until we get to live boost, because in here there's another bulb time setting. And the default setting is on 2. And I did another video on live view boost, on 1, on 2, and off, and I go into a lot more detail about how those things work. But just a long story short, on 2 brightens the image as much as it possibly can so that you can almost see in the dark, okay? On 1 brightens the image about 3 stops, which is usually not enough. And then off doesn't do any kind of brightening. It tries to reflect the exposure as it will be taken in a picture. But when you're doing bulb and long exposures, it's not going to be able to do that, okay? So when you look at this, right, we have a pretty good view of what we're taking a picture of here, because the on 2 is brightening up the image as much as it can. It's not the actual exposure or how the exposure is going to look. It's just brightening it up so that you can see the entire composition, okay? But if I take it out of live time or live bulb, let's say I go back in manual mode, a 40-second shot, what we're looking here now is the on 1 setting. And on 1, again, only brightens the image 2 or 3 stops. It's not enough. And this I could probably still compose, but definitely if it was even a little darker, let me adjust the ND filter a little bit. Let's say it's this dark. You definitely would not be able to compose your picture or do any kind of manual focusing for that matter, okay? But if I put it back into live bulb or live time, see how it's brightening up the image? It's an artificial brightness, but it's doing its best to show you everything in the scene. So when you're doing long exposure photography, you want to choose on 2 if it's very, very dark out. Okay, let's go into another menu setting. Okay, let's stay in the exposure setting, menu E, and here's the noise reduction. I have it set to on for long exposures, but you can also turn it off or put it in auto. When it's in auto, I think if the exposure is like 1 second or 2 seconds long, it'll automatically do the noise reduction, or higher, 60 seconds, 30 minutes, whatever. But if I know I'm doing long exposure or night photography, I'm just going to leave it on, okay? Because that's a very handy feature, and we discussed noise reduction just a little bit ago. Noise filter, I like to have set to low, okay? This only affects your JPEG files, unlike the noise reduction filter, which is for RAW and JPEG. The noise filter is only for your JPEG. So I set it to low just to kind of get a head start on the noise reduction. But if you want to do all the processing yourself on a JPEG, just turn it off, okay? And then you can work on it yourself. That way you're sure you're going to get the maximum detail possible out of the JPEGs that this camera can produce, okay? And ISO steps, I don't think any of this matters. But if we scroll down further, the next bulb time timer menu item, this is like an egg timer. Basically, it limits how long the shutter will stay open. So the default setting is 8 minutes. So if I'm holding the shutter for 8 minutes, or I did the live time where I just touched the shutter button, after 8 minutes, the camera is going to automatically stop the exposure and then do the noise reduction and write it to the card. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're still holding the button down, if you're using a remote trigger, 8 minutes is it. But this can be adjusted. Okay, you can adjust this down to 1 minute, and the maximum is 30 minutes. So you can set this timer from anywhere from 1 minute to 30 minutes. And it's really handy if you already know, or let's say you've been experimenting with different exposure times, and you know that 4 minutes is enough time to capture the image, or it's exactly the right time to capture the image that you want. So then this in combination with the anti-shock delay that we had set earlier of 2 seconds means that virtually you've eliminated basically all possible sources of vibration to the camera, because if I set this to 4 minutes, okay, and I have it in live time, and I have anti-shock, and I have anti-shock with 2-second delay, basically what that means is that I can push the shutter button, all the way down. It'll wait 2 seconds before it starts the exposure, so long after I've moved my hand off the camera, and then after 4 minutes the timer will finish the exposure, so I don't even have to touch the shutter again to finish the exposure. So that's probably the best way to do long exposure photography with these cameras without using a remote shutter. Okay, and I've been tempted to buy remote shutter time to time because they're only like $30, but I just don't do that much. I don't do too many long exposure photographies. If I really get into it, I might invest in one, because then I don't have to worry about ever touching the camera for the shutter. Okay, but this is sort of a workaround. Okay, the only other problem with this timer is that it is limited to 30 minutes. So no matter what you do, if you hold the shutter button down, if you have a remote trigger, if you set the or you're in live bulb and you don't touch the shutter again after you started the exposure, it's automatically going to stop after 30 minutes, and there's really no way around it. So if you want to do long exposure photography beyond 30 minutes per exposure, you're going to have to start stacking images in Photoshop or something, because the Olympus camera is just limited to 30 minutes. And if someone knows of a way around that, just let me know in the comments below. Let everyone know. But as far as I could find, and I've dug through a few forums, 30 minutes is it. And honestly, 99.9% of the time, that's probably enough, right? But I did see a guy do like these 1 and 2 hour exposures of the ocean, and he was like on the beach, and there was a pier. It's a really beautiful picture. If I can remember where I saw that, I'll put a link down below. I just can't remember who the photographer was or what his name was. So, but I'll put a link down below. It might have even been another YouTube video. So, like I said, if I find it, I'll put a link down below. Okay. The next line item here is bulb time monitor, and all that is when you're in bulb mode, live bulb, or live time, it's going to dim the display as much as it can by default to -7. And the thought process being, one, to save battery life, which it really doesn't save that much. But if you can get a couple more frames, over the night because you have this dim, why not, right? And the other one is, to reduce any kind of light pollution from the camera itself. It's very unlikely that, there's enough light from the monitor to bounce off, say, the tripod or anything around it to interfere with what's in front of the camera. But, I think the main purpose really was to just try to save as much battery life as possible. Okay, and then we're back to live bulb and live time menu, which we've already discussed. This is just the live view updating at a certain interval and how many times. Okay, and I believe that is it. We are done. Yeah, there's no other settings for a bulb, live bulb, or live time. Okay, that's pretty much it. I think I kind of hit every setting that would affect the bulb, and live time. There's a bunch of other settings that control exposure that, are related to any time you take a picture, so I didn't really want to get into that. This video is already really long, and I'm sorry about that, but I try to be thorough. I try to do these straight through uncut so that you can follow along. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and especially thank you for the really kind feedback I've been getting. I really appreciate that, because when I started this channel, people were saying you got to have tough skin, because you're going to get all these trolls and flamers, and that just hasn't happened. You guys have been really great, so thank you very much. And I got a new logo down here at the well, one of the corners for my Rob Trek to subscribe. So hit the subscribe button if you'd like to see more videos, and I'll do my best to give you tutorials on the Olympus cameras best I can. Thanks again.